Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Heather Gatney and I'm the coordinator of the CVFS webinar series. Our host today is Anna Shetler, master's student at the Population Research Institute and Department of Sociology and Criminology at Penn State University. Anna is going to present a study of how individual egalitarian beliefs about caste and gender correlate with shared activity spaces in the Chitwan Valley of Nepal. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation. We ask that you remain muted until then. During the Q&A, you may unmute and ask your question, or you can submit a question at any time today using the chat feature. We'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this point. A recording of this webinar and the slides will soon be available on the CVFS website. So it's all yours now, Anna.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. And thanks everybody for having me here today. So I'm Anna Shetler. I haven't been able to attend very many of these webinars because of class conflicts these past 2 semesters. So I want to really thank you all for taking time out of your day to come to this one. And I hope I can represent the Chitwan Valley Family Study well. So because I'm mostly new to this group, I thought I would introduce myself a little bit first. I grew up in northern Indiana and went to college there, about 2.5 hours away from Ann Arbor, where I think most of you are coming from today. And there I studied chemistry, biology, and psychology. And some of that has kind of seeped into my current work. Then after that, I was at the National Institutes of Health for 2 years in a social networks lab. And now I'm at Penn State in the sociology and demography programs, and I'm a second year right now trying to finish my master's thesis. I first got started on the Chitwan Data because of my amazing advisor who is with us today, Dr. Scott Ubiku, who a lot of you already know. Scott and I have developed the project I'm going to talk about today into a paper, and we're working on getting it published now. And since I have only been dabbling in this data for a year or 2 now, I'm still very new to this data and to the Nepal population. So I'm very much looking forward to all of your questions and our discussion after my presentation. So in this paper, I just want to give a overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So our main innovation is linking intergroup social relations research with the activity space or neighborhood research to explore how individual beliefs are distributed across place. So our main contribution is to document the relationship between activity spaces and beliefs about others. And to give a spoiler, we first find that there is an interdependency among those who share activity spaces. People with similar beliefs tend to occupy the same spaces. And our second finding is that people with greater exposure to outsiders or others in their activity space tend to have more positive beliefs towards such others. And I'll now give a bit of background and theoretical basis for our project. So from past literature, primarily in sociology and demography, we know that primary groups have close connections with individuals' personal attitudes. So for example, Cooley argued that such primary groups included not just the family, but also other surrounding social groups like one's neighborhood. And there's evidence of connections of neighborhood beliefs with behaviors. For example, neighborhood climates, towards smoking, so attitudes about smoking, have been found to be associated with teen smoking behaviors. And in the context of Nepal, there have been multiple connections made between neighborhood beliefs and behaviors. And I have a list of those here at the bottom. And a main focus of belief literature in Nepal so far has focused on fertility and marriage beliefs and behaviors. And now here is where we begin kind of meshing the theories of psychology and sociology together. So one explanation for how neighborhoods and individuals have the same beliefs and behaviors comes from social learning theory, which was put forth by Bandura. So like in his famous Bobo doll experiment, people learn from what others do and they model behaviors and beliefs of those around them. And other explanations within socialization are definitely relevant, like exposure to other ideas and also social pressure. And in terms of neighborhoods, it's especially important to talk about selection. So people select into environments with people similar to themselves. So it makes sense that neighborhood beliefs and behaviors correlate with individuals' beliefs and behaviors of that neighborhood. And while we can acknowledge that both selection and socialization are at play in neighborhood and individual beliefs, Levitin and Visser, might be butchering their names, but they propose that in terms of attitudes and beliefs, it's really important to think about socialization because how we are continually shaped by those around us if we select them initially or not. And then we also know that contact with others has connections with attitudes. So Alport's contact hypothesis imposes a more directional aspect on socialization and beliefs. Alport proposes that positive intergroup contact reduces bias between groups. For example, people with more diverse friendships are more likely to have positive attitudes towards others. And there's evidence of this among individuals and within neighborhoods. There's also been evidence that even indirect contact with others can impact prejudices. For example, the study by Dasgupta and Rivera in 2008, they found that people merely being exposed to photographs of outgroup members cause participants to have more positive outgroup beliefs. So even without the direct contact, there was still an impact on people's biases. So both direct and indirect contact with outgroup members have the possibility to contribute to more positive outgroup beliefs. And while groups may not physically interact with each other, their beliefs may be shaped by merely sharing the same environment or social space as others. And I also want to note for this intergroup contact literature that the in-group is usually defined as a group that ranks higher in the social order than the out-group. So for example, in Nepal, the in-group could be those of who are higher in the caste hierarchy. And now we can turn to activity-space literature. So activity-space research has grown in recent years and explores how people traverse the world beyond the neighborhood. People occupy different places in cities, towns, wherever you are, and people are selected and socialized to occupy certain areas. And Scott and I think it's incredibly important to look at places beyond the neighborhood because work, commuting, and socializing in specific areas can have just as large impacts on humans as their neighborhood. And we also think it's critical to look beyond the neighborhood because whereas the primary groups of neighborhoods are typically homogeneous, activity spaces can expose people to all sorts of other people. So in our study, we use this idea of shared activity spaces. We build from an idea that Christopher Browning came up with about ecological networks. And Browning's idea is for networks that traverse both neighborhoods and outside the neighborhood. And we take a slightly different approach. So for this paper, we really wanted to know how people are organized and are exposed to different people within the Chitwan Valley. So we define a shared activity space network as all the individuals who share activity spaces with a focal individual. And then drawing from more social network terminology, we define a tie between two individuals within this network as a geotie. So really explaining that these people have an overlapping activity space. And within these shared activity space networks, it is important to note that these people who are tied across space don't necessarily have direct contact with one another. They may indirectly or directly have social contact. So drawing from all of this background, literature, and conceptualization of the shared activity space network, we want to answer if beliefs are clustered among shared activity space networks. So do people occupy the same spaces? Do people who occupy the same spaces tend to have similar beliefs? And then second, we want to know if positive outgroup beliefs are more likely among diverse shared activity space networks. So in other words, do in-group individuals, like those of higher castes or men, who have greater exposures to outgroup individuals, do they have more positive beliefs towards such outgroups? And here's just an illustration of our hypotheses, if that helps my fellow visual learners. So we first hypothesize that the beliefs of a focal individual will be positively associated with the beliefs of others in the focal individual's activity space. And then secondly, we hypothesize that a focal individual with a more diverse activity space will have more positive or egalitarian outgroup attitudes. And for the first hypothesis, I want to make clear that we look at all types of people in their shared activity networks. But for the second hypothesis, we limit to looking at people who identify as Kshatriya, Brahmin, or male, and their exposure to their respective outgroup. And so in the context of Nepal, we decided to go with the two most stratifying characteristics, caste and gender. And so to reiterate the second hypothesis, we hypothesize that those of the majority caste who have greater exposure to those of minority castes will have more positive beliefs towards such castes. And then similarly with gender, we expect that males who share more activity spaces with more females will have more egalitarian beliefs towards females. And so our data for this study comes from the overarching Chitwan Valley Family Study, and we specifically use data that was collected in 2015 as part of a broader study on activity space and data collection. So during this, residents of the Chitwan Valley were interviewed about specific activities that represented typical daily life in the Chitwan Valley. People were asked about types of activity settings, and these included banks, health clinics, local government offices, restaurants, schools, places where clubs met, where they were employed, where they went for recreation and worship, and also places for shopping, visiting friends and relatives. So respondents were able to mark locations that they had visited in the past week, providing a temporal bound on the data. And in the original study, this was done using both tablet data and physical maps. And the tablet map was able to automatically log the latitude and longitude of each individual's activity spaces. And because the tablet data provided much greater accuracy than the paper data, the analysis that we use here only uses the tablet data. So yes, and then in addition to the spatial activity space data, the interview also asked respondents about their own demographics and beliefs, and we incorporate all of those into our analysis. And again, I wanted to give a visual representation of what we mean by an activity space and what we mean by a shared activity space network. So here's a map of part of the Chitwan Valley, and overlaid is a hypothetical activity space of one of the respondents. And so we can see that this hypothetical individual lives kind of in the middle of the valley at the blue dot, and they visit other places throughout the week shown in red. So maybe they go collect fodder, they go to the corner store, they go to their favorite restaurant in Baratpur. And we can look at all of these locations of this one individual and see who else in the data reported the same activity within 200 meters of the focal individual. And so anyone who intersects with this hypothetical individual has a geotie to them and becomes part of this individual shared activity space. And then we repeat this process for everybody in the data set. And in creating the networks this way, we're really taking a exclusive approach to defining a shared activity space network. So the geoties exist only for members who report the same activity in the past week. So if a focal individual reports shopping in a specific area, geoties connect the focal individual to sample members who also reported shopping. And we find that, we do this because we believe that defining the shared activity networks in this way increases the possibility of indirect or direct contact occurring between the focal individual and the people in their shared network. And then after creating everybody's network, we then calculate the average beliefs of the networks and the amount of exposure to others within the network. So for hypothesis 1, we calculate the mean of caste belief and the mean of gender belief for all participants with geoties, to the focal individual. And then for hypothesis 2, we calculate the diversity of geoties within networks by measuring exposure to others. So for caste, we calculate Kshatriya Brahmins, focal individuals' exposure to all other castes, so Dalit, the Janajati, and Nawar. And then for gender, we calculate male focal individuals' exposure to females. And for both caste and gender in hypothesis 2, we use the exposure measure proposed by Wong and Shaw in 2011, which I've illustrated here. And then the beliefs that we incorporate into our study are 2 specific beliefs that respondents were asked about during the interview. And again, we chose to look at statements related to Chitwan stratification. So we chose to look at caste and gender. And when people were originally answering these questions, their agreement was measured on a Likert scale. And so following collection, we did have to reverse code the gender belief so that higher values for both of these represent higher agreement with egalitarian views. And we are using just singular questions to capture both concepts of gender egalitarianism and caste egalitarianism. And in doing so, we want to recognize that there are possible types of egalitarianism that we aren't capturing here with these single questions. However, we do want to note that these questions have been found to be consistent and reliable across time within the study, and longitudinal studies could use this data in the future if they wanted to. And now getting into some of the data. So just to orient you to the table here, on the rows here show specific characteristics of focal individuals, and then moving across in columns, we first have statistics for the entirety of the sample, so all 957. And then only those who identify as Kshatriya Brahmin or not, and then we have those who identify as male or not. And a couple of things that I want to note are that the sample is approximately 30 years of age across the board. About 42% of the sample are Kshatriya Brahmin, and about 40% are male. And looking at educational attainment here, I think is telling of the disparities between or within caste and gender. So you can see that Kshatriya Brahmin have a mean of about 9 years, whereas Other castes have just 6, and there's a similar trend for gender where males typically have higher educational attainment. And so this is just looking at each individual in the sample, and now I'm going to add in details about the average shared activity networks. Oops. And so on average, things that I want to point out here are that on average, the activity networks had about 30 people in them. And the other statistics shown here don't really vary much between the groups. I do want to note, however, that overall people have very little exposure to others. So on average, the exposure index for other castes is just 0.2, and the exposure index for other genders is just 0.1. So then in our results, we use just regular linear regressions to estimate effects. This is just showing hypothesis 1 for caste and for gender. So for hypothesis 1, we find that people tend to share beliefs about caste with those in their activity spaces. So for each 1 unit increase in the average caste belief of the shared activity network is associated with a 0.3 increase on the caste belief scale. So in other words, a focal individual's belief about caste is similar to the caste belief of other sample members with whom the focal individual shares activity spaces. And when estimating the model using gender, the direction of the association is consistent with what we expected, but doesn't reach a 0.05 significance level. And then for hypothesis 2, again, we're looking at caste and gender separately. And for the caste model here, we're explicitly looking at the highest caste exposure to lower castes. And then for gender, we're explicitly looking at male exposure to females. So despite a decreased sample size, so only 406 here for caste, we do find that greater exposure to those in lower castes and shared activity networks is associated with Kshatriya Brahmin individuals having more egalitarian caste beliefs. And then for males, greater exposure to females in shared activity networks has a positive relationship with male focal individuals' gender beliefs. But again, this association is not statistically significant. And so in returning to our hypotheses, we find evidence for both hypotheses and particularly for caste. The caste beliefs of a focal individual are positively associated with the caste beliefs of those in their shared activity network. And then secondly, Kshatriya Brahmin focal individuals with greater activity space exposures to lower castes have more positive outgroup attitudes. So we find evidence of correlated beliefs by activity space, and we also find evidence for the contact hypothesis within activity spaces. And we believe these findings are innovative and interesting within themselves, but it's also helpful to think about their possible broader impact. So clustering by belief across space expands our understanding of what places people occupy and how social organization of places actually works. So people may be organizing by belief, or perhaps their beliefs are being informed by the places that they occupy. And additionally, for the exposure finding, we still can't differentiate between causation and selection, but we can use this information to study broader implications of exposure. And I'm also happy to talk about these additional findings that are listed here in this slide more during the Q&A. I won't go through them in detail now, though. And as with all research, we have limitations to our study. I particularly wanted to note that we just have cross-sectional data here that asks individuals about activities of just the past week. And so it would be great in future work to have more in-depth activity space data perhaps using mobile devices to really see the paths that people take and who they might actually interact with. And so we'd be able to differentiate between the more indirect and the direct contact that people might be having. And as I mentioned before, our data and analyses can't differentiate between causation and selection, so making it rather hard to make definitive conclusions about hypothesis two. And then in future research, we think it would be great to study broader egalitarian beliefs. So there's this idea of the cognitive liberalization hypothesis that extends the contact hypothesis, saying that people who have greater outgroup exposures are more likely to be egalitarian, not only in outgroup beliefs, but in beliefs about other things too, like environmentalism. So I think it would be really interesting to study broader beliefs, and perhaps we could revisit some of the fertility and marriage beliefs studied in neighborhoods in the past with the Chitwan data. And then we also think it would be fruitful to extend this research to other locations to see how our results hold up in other countries. We think it'd be really interesting to look at Western countries to see if there's a difference in results. And then finally, here are some ways to contact me if you have further comments and questions after our discussion today. And I also wanted to plug that I'll be at PAA in Atlanta in 2 weeks, and I hope to see some of you there. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was a very nice job. And I gotta say, it was a nice job of talking about the topic and the data from Nepal. But I want to especially applaud the nice job of mixing sociology and psychology. I think the older I get, the more excited I am about the Chitwan work in general's mixing of those two things, where a lot of other studies have not evolved that direction for reasons I won't pretend I understand. I will say that as soon as I see something cool, I immediately start thinking about what's next. I got one question that you might not be able to answer. You might need Scott or Dirga to answer, and then a couple other questions I'm sure you can answer. My first was just, I was caught by the 2015 date to the data collection, and I don't recall whether this was before the earthquake or after the earthquake. Does anybody know the answer to that one, whether this data collection took place before earthquake or after earthquake?
I'll say I have no idea.
Yeah, me too.
Scott, do you remember? I believe it was before the earthquake.
I'm going to think before, but you know, hey, Google is out there. Anyone look it up?
Yeah. But I bet it was before, which, you know, kind of makes me want to go to, oh gosh, wish we had done this a couple days after the earthquake, because I wonder how much difference that made. But maybe that kind of immediate thing isn't as interesting, because this idea of how exogenous events have affected activity spaces has been on my mind since the pandemic. But the fact that you all actually have these measures from right before the earthquake is interesting. That was probably abrupt, and it wasn't in Chitwan the same kind of spatial disruption as it was other places in Nepal, so it might not be. I guess, and I wanted to make sure that I understood one of the, so I think I understood the presentation, and I know that the measures themselves, I probably did not understand. And I got super excited about, you know, separate than the attitude items, which everybody here knows I love, about the shared activity space measures, where I think you described one as sort of the heterogeneity of the activity space, and that it was really low on average for, did I get that right? That really these are very homogeneous activity spaces somehow? Is that the correct understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right.
Because, you know, I immediately went to, oh my, what an opportunity to go back and redo this and see if they've become more heterogeneous over time behaviorally, in addition to examining the intersection with beliefs, attitudes, various psychological dimensions of life. I think behavioral change in heterogeneity and how that's associated with people's experiences, whether they're educational attainment or travel and migration or various things that we have measured in various parts of the data, will be super interesting. I take it that these attitudes and beliefs were a separate data collection, like the activity space was a separate data collection. Is that correct?
I know that they're a part of like the larger interview that was done, but I don't know the specifics of that.
They were done at the same time. So as ISCR went out there and had the paper questionnaire and said,
Right.
hey, blah, blah, blah. And then, oh, you say you have a school? Here's this tablet. Tell me where it is. So it's
No, the
contemporary.
tablet part is so much more vivid in my mind, Scott, because it was such an exciting methodological breakthrough. And I guess, and anybody wants this one, but so I'm excited about, let's go back and do it again. I'm excited about, what all would you do if you could do it again? And then I'm excited about, what methodological breakthrough is next, given that this, which I consider a pretty fundamental and crucial methodological breakthrough, is almost 10 years old now, which is kind of amazing by itself. But can we figure out how to get both space and time? Because I'm just curious about even like day of the week, time of day, are they in the same space at the same time, or do they just happen to cross through the same space?
Right, yeah. I think that would be
Yes.
really excellent.
These are the tools. Yeah, everyone is carrying these. And yes, we just need to design a study. And there are possibilities, either the phone with GPS, or there are now handwrist that tracks
Anna Dirga walked into this on his own. I want to go on record. He didn't have to go here, but he did. So do I get to tease you, Dirga? We have a box of these in Nepal that we were going to pilot. I assume no work has been done yet on that. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, we need IRB from Michigan. That's all we need. We have been in the field face to face, and yeah, we are just waiting for IRB from Michigan.
One of us should remind Pam of that, just so everybody else in this conversation understands what he and I are talking about. One of our speakers from the end of last semester is Pam Jagger, who's trained in political science, economics, and studies the environment. And in this case, air pollution. And she procured, in addition to some community level air monitors that Dirga has up and positioned around Chitwan now, a handful of wearable air monitors. And Dirga, remind me of the age range, because this was kind of cool from a individual level exposure to air pollution depends a lot on where they spend their day, their activity space, and where they traverse also. So I think this was partly it's an IRB issue no matter what, but it's partly a complicated one because it's all kids, right?
Yep, 8 to 15. Yeah.
8 to 15, where the idea is, okay, there's their home and we could monitor air pollution there, but do they go to school? Do they have a job? Where do they traverse? Where do they spend their time during the day? But that team who has an R01 under review that got scored, but isn't gonna go on the first try. That team is very focused just on air pollution. But it seems like this kind of opportunity for the rest of us to grow sort of what we measure that way. I don't know, Anna. Like if you're looking at the data, I think you correctly raised the selection versus causation issue problem. I don't think fine-tuning time of day or there is going to solve that. I'm not sure how to solve that problem, honestly. But if you had this kind of like, we're tracking people around either with the phone that Dirga is suggesting or the wearables that I'm excited about, what would you do? What would we do if we had that kind of data?
Honestly, I think like the opportunities are kind of endless with that. Because you can see like where people are going and who they might be interacting with, and from like a psychology standpoint. And I think that would be really cool to see just that. And I'm sure there are other things that people could do with that type of activity space data that would also be really cool. Like in regards to not just beliefs, but behaviors, and even like incorporating other things like air pollution to look at like health outcomes.
I don't know this area of science really, and I've never studied segregation. Best I can do is I'm friends with Doug Massey. That's all I got. You mentioned, wanting to do it in the US too, and I couldn't help but think of all the issues around race and ethnicity in the United States, where, caste that you're looking at here is also sort of race and ethnicity in Nepal. And it made me, sort of wonder, is there work on this in the US on these kind of like segregation topics? Because my understanding is one of the old school ideas was people who are in one group avoid going to a space where there's people in the other group. And so, sort of like walk a different way, drive a different way, whatever that is, and would affect, would shape our understanding of this behavioral index of intersection. And Heather, I'm gonna officially shut up over the popular demand.
Yep, we have some hands raised. Sarah, did you want to go?
Yeah, I had to put my hand up to encourage Bill to share the floor. So I thank you so much for presenting this. I'm super excited. Every time I see Scott, I ask him about these data. So I'm really excited to see that something happening with the activity space stuff. And I am really, so I have a lot of just kind of curiosity questions. So, okay, you said these spaces are fairly homogenous. Am I right about that in terms of how? And so I was surprised that there was no kind of effect on gender egalitarian attitudes, right? And I was wondering if this is because it's not just that they're not interacting with like men aren't interacting with women and women aren't interacting with men, but the type of space is so different. So that it's really about their daily functions and not so much about their interactions. So like if you were a woman who works in an office, you would probably have more interactions with men, but you're already a different kind of woman. And so I guess I'm curious about like, how much more can be done with just these data in terms of understanding these spaces? And I think just the description of these spaces, the heterogeneity and homogeneity of interactions. And then also, I know with these data we always have like a million possible attitude questions, but I don't know for this 2015 data, are there lots of questions and these were sort of the only ones that like kind of worked, or did you just happen to pick these two and find these effects? This would, I guess, not be like a thing we would talk about outside of our CVFS world of like, I'm not encouraging data mining here. I'm just curious if there were many other regressions that were run.
You heard the part about recording and distributing. We talk openly here, and we record and distribute. Whatever that means to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Sarah. Those are great questions. I'll start with your last one. So from the data that I've seen, I think there's like a little less than 10 maybe statements that people respond to, but these are the ones that distinctly like ask about caste and gender. And then there are other ones that talk about like how people feel about divorce and separation, at what age it's good to be married, like how many kids people want to have. I'm blanking on some of the other ones. So, but yeah, we initially were looking at beliefs more than just caste and gender, but we found that the beliefs didn't really go together well in any kind of index. So we just decided to go with the caste and gender one, but we could potentially go back and look at them and expand the study to look at the other ones. So that'd be a great idea. And then your other question was,
Well, I'll restate that one, but I have one tiny question, which is, were these respondents, are these new respondents or are these CVFS respondents in these data?
I'm pretty sure they're respondents that have participated before.
So we have lots of information about them, other than just what's in here. Oh, okay. So then my other question was about the activity space in general, I guess. And just, can you tell me a little bit more, or know any more about the heterogeneity and kind of use of space and what people are doing? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this is something that Scott and I talked about a lot at the beginning of our project, just like what type of people you're interacting with beyond just gender. So like when you're in an activity space with a woman, is she like collecting fodder, or is she in your workplace, or is she just shopping nearby you? So like we talked about possibly going in and looking at different types of activities that people are doing, but there is not a whole lot of data on that. So like the places that people primarily mention that they go to are shopping locations. And so there's not a whole lot of variety there to work with. But yeah, that's a really good point of, I think it would be great to just do kind of like a descriptive analysis or paper on what types of places and people people are interacting with. So yeah. Does that answer your question? And Coulter?
Yeah, I agree. This is a great talk. It was really fun, and more importantly, it was really well done. So I had a couple things that I thought of. First, so Bill, to your point, and Anna, maybe you already know this. So Marta Tienda has done some of this work, specifically in the United States, I think even using the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study, like a subset. And she did exactly what Dirga is talking about, which is using phones and just tracking where people are walking, where they're going. And they take like a, like essentially a sample of their week or a sample of a certain period of time. So there's been some work on that. And I think you're right. The other people I think about when it comes to wearables in particular are Bridget Gooseby and Jacob Cheadle, who are at Texas, who have a focus more on biological outcomes, but still their point there is, some of their work has shown that certain in the United States race ethnic groups, if there's a large enough enclave, they don't interact at all. So it's highly segregated. In fact, if there's smaller percentages, certain groups are forced to interact and then therefore that could have both positive and negative effects. So anyway, so there is work out there on this that I think could be really cool. But again, I love what you're doing. I think all the innovations, everything that the people have said. One thing I was wondering is seeing some of these egalitarian questions, and maybe Dirga and Bill, you know this better. It triggered a whole bunch of those developmental idealism questionnaire questions that I know exist somewhere, and I don't know how connected they are to this group of people, but there are lots of questions around that might, I know they're probably before this, but you could imagine having measures long before and seeing how they correlate with measures now. I don't know.
Interesting. I don't know. The DI developmental idealism study was 08 individual interviews, but I think the panel follow-up ran through like 2011 or 2012. So although it was before this 15 fieldwork, not as far before as you might think, depending on, I don't know how the samples overlapped. I didn't know whether or not these individuals were in the CVFS, but you know, Sarah and Scott both deal with this all the time. But I you know, just because they're from the same household registry system doesn't necessarily mean
they link up. Yeah.
We can link them, right?
But it just occurred to me, like, yeah, as Sarah was saying, there's lots of data that we have on them, and when you started talking about egalitarian things like it, that's going to bring that up in my mind, is all of those questions that were asked. So not that this project needs more complexity, but like, you know, for the 4th and 5th paper, you have these other data sets that you could tie into.
Well, and Anna, don't make this problem just like Needle Scott, because of course the better able is to time this gigantic R01 project he's about to launch on this topic with your completing the PhD and launching your career, the better off we all are. But you know, I think we're in this cool activity space of being able to pick and choose from different parts of CVFS, different psychological measures you might want to. And you know, and I appreciate you giving a shout out to the work on fertility attitudes and marriage attitudes. And I have vivid memory of Scott not really being that interested in fertility, so he gave the marriage stuff a try. I think one problem with those of us who've been at it for 20 or more years is that, you know, we get tired and we switch what we're interested in, and certainly happened to me. No problem for who else it's happened to, but as new folks come in, there are these opportunities to take advantage of, whether it was the developmental idealism content Coulter was talking about, the marriage and fertility content you mentioned, these specific kinds of items. And I have to believe that the changes going on in Nepal, if nothing else, the sheer growth of the population in Chitwan, which, you know, when I've been recently, was stunning to me with this like 25-year time horizon. There has to be more sharing. Those activity spaces have to be growing more heterogeneous than the numbers you showed us. And it must be an opportunity to study, you know, more how that heterogeneity is intersecting with each different area of these kind of attitudes and beliefs. I'm trying to choose my word carefully because I still don't know how to deal with selection causation. And thank you for citing some interesting psych work, which my understanding is those folks are so keen on experimentation, partly because that's the tool they use to try and make some kind of causal argument. I don't have a good sense of how in the world we'd carry that off here. Scott, I'll shut up.
Yeah, thank you everyone for, you know, engaging with Anna's work here and giving us some great suggestions. I just want to respond to something what Billy said earlier in terms of, you know, if we were to do it again, or what would we do? And number one, I would agree with Deirdre, we would use mobile phones to do this. So the reason we use tablets is because the first version of this R21 that was written, I think I put the first draft in 2011, right? The iPad came out in 2010, right? So this is a long time ago, right? Second of all, what would we do if we did it again? You know, mobile phones, but also could we get some experimental or causal aspect to this, right? And I think one way would be, let's say for these respondents, if we can find them again, we say, hey, half of them, you get $10 a week. The other half, you get $10 a week only at this specific store in this purposely chosen part of Chitwan. Specifically, it's a more Chetri Brahmin area, or it's more rural area. It's a more, right? So you could actually then sort of nudge people to certain activity spaces in a fair way, because some people get $10 cash, other people get $10 credit in a certain neighborhood, and now you can actually sort of steer people, and now you're causally, exogenously changing people's activity spaces and see, hey, we sent you to this part of Bharatpur that's more, you know, this caste. Do you now become more positive towards that caste? I mean, Who
Yeah,
knows? So I think experimental designs are one way to go.
Scott, I believe you and I have had some long-term conversations about that insofar as we probably talked about some kind of exogenous shock experiment upwards of 20 years ago. And could we do it or not? And I remember Susan Murphy teaching me, at least, this lesson that, hey, Bill, make sure if you do that, that they're really causally close to to the outcome you want to study, which is interesting. And the other thing I've got, which is, Anna, maybe a question for you, Scott, or the longer term conversation about this. Okay, we could do this with respect to a whole bunch of different mixing and a whole bunch, and Scott, you went to, well, is the ethnic group that you're mixing with, how do you feel about them? But I think to get us resources, what is the really compelling, unanswered, maybe health related, maybe more general, but really compelling, unanswered question that we could answer by doing this? Because I think if we've got one of those and the design idea and the phone thing, I think this gets funded.
So are you going to tell us what the compelling Uber question that we all want to know about life in Chitwan in 2022?
Oh, by the way, I'll tell you one reaction to putting it that way, which is it's not compelling, I don't believe, to any study section to answer a question about life in Chitwan. If you're not answering a question about life in general, and Chitwan happens to be a golden opportunity to answer the question, let's not talk about it. But with that secret sauce aside, I mean, I do think, gosh, I'm very excited about the work I'm doing with this geneticist now, because in psychiatric genetics, there's no other study besides the Chitwan Valley Family Study that has phenotype psychiatric and genotype psychiatric for mother, father, child triads. And so it turns out, if you want to know the answer to those questions at all, anywhere, Chitwan Valley Family Study is your only bet. And so, that immediately separates us from, do you want to know about Nepal or not? Which is certainly part of the secret sauce here.
Well, I don't have an answer for the overarching question that's going to save all of our lives, but I was looking through some of the literature that we had that we cite in our paper earlier today, and there's one study by, I think it was Greg Sharp in 2015, and they found that people who entered neighborhoods that were primarily like of another group had better health outcomes. And I don't necessarily know the mechanisms behind that, but I think that could be a really interesting thing to look at. And we could do that with experimental data.
I mean, Anna, you just said a couple really important things, by the way. You were reading something from 2015 and saw this. And everybody whose faces I can see knows that I'm terrible at reading. And I think, don't discount the role that the student plays in this process of what are the crucial questions that we might be able to answer. I feel like this interaction between mentor and mentee is so great for both parties, because mentor might be able to steer, how do you approach this? But I think it's often mentee who's reading and has to do this for this class and that for that class, and then write a thesis on this other thing, and discovers, hey, Bill, did you know that it looks like nobody's ever answered this question? What do you think? And that conversation, that back and forth, I think is part of why, we love trying to have these webinars, and thank you for doing it, and want to encourage more of this shared activity space, but also part of why it works in general to come up with the key unanswered questions. It's not like I don't know, maybe I'm a bad example, Anna, but I don't think the professoriate are sitting around their desks with all the answers. I think the new perspective is crucial to making this work.
Jennifer?
Hey, so I'd like to circle back to something that Scott said, and Anna, I also have a specific question for you. So Scott had mentioned potentially being able to get at nudging people into certain areas to look at this, and really to see how nudging people into different areas would shape attitudes and behaviors potentially. So if one did that, is there any research, or does anybody know, like, how long would you have to study that for in order to actually see a potential change? And then the follow-up question, Anna, is that something that you would be interested in? And if so, like could you imagine yourself doing something like this in the future if that were possible, or if the funding was there for it?
Yeah, I can take a stab at both questions. So I know like some of the psychological literature that I talked about are just like very brief one-time interactions, and they find results with just that. But I think to like actually create a long-lasting difference in beliefs, it might be necessary to do it for longer periods of time. I don't know what type of time period that would actually look like a month or a year or 10 years, or I don't know. Sounds like a lot of $10 though. And yeah, I think it would be, I really like activity-based research, so I think it would be really interesting to like also continue this project, and yeah, I think it would be cool.
I
Thank
can
you.
just chime in really quickly and say all the literature that I've seen on these experimental things, Jen, is that they see pretty immediate small effects, but I've never seen anything on a scale this large. And I don't think I've ever seen anything that's like, hey, let's do this immediate effect and then let's measure it again in 2 years. Because that would be way too costly for most of the studies that do this work.
Got it. So
And Jennifer,
is it really hard to create long-term change in terms of, like, I mean, I know that that's like the whole goal, right, for many of these like social issues. So I'm not trying to boil this down to one simple little solution, but I'm just wondering, like, in terms of like first steps or things like that, like, are you able to document really long-term shifts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
I was going to say, Jennifer, in your response to your question, I think, I hear colleagues in like human development and some of the prevention sciences talking about like just-in-time interventions where, hey, we see that you're at the bar, drinking too much gives you liver problems, right? So I think people are planning those sort of interventions, are rolling them out. I haven't seen any of that work, but that's something that using activity space and geolocation and nudges, you should have like immediate outcome, because it's targeting a specific modifiable behavior as opposed to, general belief source caste. So I don't know if others have heard about those interventions.
Oh, for sure. It's all the rage, right? I mean, especially the abuse of phones as a research tool is mainly in that space. But I think, Jen, I like to think that my inability to lose weight is one more piece of evidence that, interventions mainly don't work. People's behaviors are not that easy to change, right? And it is interesting how much intervention it takes if you get habitual. Scott, if somebody really is addicted to alcohol, I think nudging is mainly going to make me turn my phone off. I don't know how well that's going to succeed, but it is a huge area of science. Lots of money getting spent. And I would say throughout the medical sciences, Emily, I think you and I think Cheryl's working on stuff that's about maternal and child nudges. I think the kind of approach that Scott's describing is very popular throughout. We're out of time.
Yep, it's 3 o'clock already.
It's 3 o'clock, and I just thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this, and I hope we get to do more like this. This is great. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Hannah. That was really exciting to hear.
Thanks.